Well, welcome, and thank you all for joining us. What I thought we'd do to start, let's talk a little bit about the role of the board. As you've heard from all the speakers so far, I mean, the scale of investment is growing. There's earnings guidance that's being provided to the street. And one of the things that we particularly think is important is that too often when you hear discussions about governance, and I go to a lot of these events, it's almost always focused on cybersecurity, sort of somewhat independently of strategy. And at some level, you have to appreciate that we all worry about cybersecurity, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. I also think it's really hard to talk about at a conference because it's such a technical field. What I think is really important to understand that governance should not be different, is related to strategy. Sort of the riskier your strategy, sort of whether it's data or about how aggressive you're being with acquisitions, all of these things influence strategy at the board, influence board level, sort of the role of the board. So with that, let me start with you, Roxanne. Let's start with one company that you're on the board of, and tell us a little bit about the company and what's the specific digital challenge that you are facing today.
Well, I'll give you one because I know we have a number of med tech people in the audience. So I'll start with Abbott because I've got examples for all of my companies actually because everyone's dealing with the same issue, of course. But if I look at Abbott as an example, one of the products we just launched is called Freestyle Libre. And it's a blood glucose monitoring product. We have proprietary technology for the sensor that the individual puts on their arm in order to read their blood glucose. And we have a monitor, or you can use your iPhone in order to monitor your blood glucose. It's an interesting one because as we think about all the big tech companies, that is a space that you've heard Apple talk about and Google talk about and Amazon talk about. I mean, they want to get into this space. Do they want to get in as a medical? Ours is considered a medical device and has to go through all the rigorous testing of being a medical device. Whereas sometimes, that isn't always the case with the big tech companies. So it's a really interesting strategic challenge, I would say, for the board. So that would be one example, Vijay.
Right. We'll come back to those, of course.
Okay.
I'll touch on Schneider Electric. It's a Paris-based firm, energy management, energy solution. So in a complex like this, there's a lot of touch points, energy points from the plugs right through to distribution systems that manage the wiring and energy efficiency in the building. So they've been around for 100 years, but in the last 15 years, they've gone from 6 billion to 30 billion and gone very global, led very well by the CEO. And the challenge for the company, it's a B2B company, industrial company, up against GE as an example, and the power business, and they've been struggling, whereas Schneider has been doing well. And so the company has taken to heart a lot of what we are talking about here today. How do we move the software agenda in a hardware company? But there's so much you can manage in terms of power, utilization, energy distribution, automation within campuses or buildings. And so as an executive team, a decision was made about 5 years ago, that this was going to be number one priority. And we've moved from a position of less than $10 to $15 million of software in the portfolio to $1.5 billion in a 5-year window. Combination of acquisitions, of which a local company here was part of that in Orange County, a company called Invensis and Wonderware. But there's been other activities in other parts of the world where we're picking up automation and software skills within buildings. And very, very important and challenging for a company to change its image, its perspective, and bring a culture forward around the digital age. So it's a big area of effort for the company, but driven largely by the CEO and an interesting commitment to have a different type of committee within a governance context to push the agenda at the board level right through to the organization and make it be very visible within the organization that that's an important governance issue.
So we'll come back to that, but I just want to sort of underscore what Greg just said, which is we've gone from a $15 million portfolio to, what do you say, $1.5 billion?
$1 billion plus, yeah.
$1 billion plus. I mean, that is the scale of, the digitization of the industrial economy, if you will. And so we have to, and if you heard Roxanne talking about Abbott Labs, we don't know the numbers, and it doesn't really matter, but it's sort of really powerful when you think about, building these devices that were not digital once upon a time, right? We've had blood sugar monitoring for a long time, but this is, with these feedback loops that are sort of 24-hour a day. One of the things that always sort of you find intriguing is like, why does anything get measured once every 6 months, or once a month, or whenever the doctor chooses to call you in? So that's really important. Go ahead.
Well, in fact, the person that's actually using our device is checking their blood glucose just literally constantly.
Right.
Because it's so easy. They just, wave it next to their arm. How cool is that?
So I'm going to digress for a moment. I'll get to you, Mary, because I just read that. She's already spoken.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I say one thing though? Just the one thing I'd say at the board level for Ulta, because I'm also on the board, but for us, probably the biggest aspect of governance would be to make sure that we protect the amount of investment that we need, and it's very tempting to give Wall Street what they want.
Right.
And we've done resets more than once to kind of temper things down and be like, we're not going to it's really hard to predict how much investment is required, especially through the lens of technology. So trying to make sure that we don't get too far ahead of that and protect what we need to invest for the future has been important.
I think that's really important, because when the CEO of Adobe was talking, it was when they switched from perpetual licenses to sort of the annual licenses, what you end up with is a drop in earnings, but actually in the short run. And Wall Street gives you no credit for that. And so there needs to be far more of a conversation about explaining that this is actually better. But where I wanted to go with that, actually, and I digress a little bit, but there was this fantastic study that was reported in the New York Times, which is why your product is so important. You probably saw it. It turns out that most of what we know about what we eat and blood sugar is not very good. So we all know that we're supposed to avoid simple carbs and things like that, but it turns out that the number one thing that explains what we should eat is actually the gut bacteria. And every one of us reacts. Dr. Eric Topol in San Diego is very big into quantitative medicine, and he actually finds that cheesecake is just fine for him.
I'm not advocating everybody eat cheesecake.
That's a good news.
But oatmeal, which we are all told is good, was actually terrible for him. And the point is, when you throw in these machine learning tools and analyze the data, so now the reason I picked up on that was you eat, and you eat whatever it is you want, but you actually know what your own body's response was. So you don't need machine learning to tell you the answer. You're actually getting your own little scientific study. So you sort of alluded to what are the issues that is protecting capital investment?
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's like we have decided that the technology roadmap for the company is a central strategy that needs to be discussed in the boardroom all the time. We've talked about having a separate sort of technology committee, and I didn't want that. I think this is something that the entire board needs to be involved in. And to your point, it's much bigger than just cyber.
I actually have a very strong opinion on that, because I'm going to be a little cynical for a moment. But you see a lot of companies that will appoint one person who's typically a CIO from a very old line company to their board and say, now we are digitally savvy. And my response is, first of all, that's the wrong guy, because that company wasn't doing anything that's particularly exciting.
Even though we love CIOs.
No, we love CIOs.
I know you're.
Well, I have a big CIO roundtable with 28 members. Please rejoin the group after what I just said. No, my CIOs are very good.
I pulled you out of the fire there.
I know, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, now I lost my train of thought. But
He's still in the fire.
So let's talk about sort of the role of the board around capital investments and protecting capital, because you've got the pressure from the street.
Right.
In an ideal world, you should have, because you always talk about the separation between board and the executive suite, right?
Right.
But increasingly, all of you sort of alluded to this, which is part of your job is become making sure, and Roxanne, you mentioned this even the last time you were here when you were talking about Target, the board's responsibility is also to make sure that the company is digitally savvy. So what have been your various approaches to protecting investment, making sure you have the right leadership talent, making sure you're moving fast enough, things that are sort of the relationship between strategy and governance? Greg, I'll start with you on that one.
The makeup of the board is very important in that whole question you're bringing up. Most companies are trying to address this by having several, I would say, very experienced board members who have gone through some form of digital challenge or transitional challenge that's important to the company. And those different experiences in that room when there's a dialogue on a challenging issue around strategy, and that's usually the focus, is where's the strategy going and what are the options, because nothing's always black and white, you're always taking some risk. Ideally, you're complementing yourself with good operators who can help challenge the management team with whatever concept or approach they're bringing to the table, and also can bring different ideas from their experiences to enhance and maybe speed up the direction that the team is taking. So that complement or that mix of people on the board, I think, is very important, to the point, even though you might have a committee, in my case, and on one board, and I know a few that have done this and most that haven't, sometimes there's just extra energy that the CEO and the team wants to put and impose on the organization to drive the organization change in a more meaningful manner. It doesn't take away from the broad discussions with the full board on the meaty issues that need to come to the table. But if you have a group of people, in the case of Schneider, I'll talk to that one again here, there's 4 of us that have got a strong background in transformations or technology. We got an ex-HP CEO. We have the current CEO of Cadence Systems Designs, which is an advanced player up in the Bay Area. And then we have a minister that was the head of digital economy in France for the last few years that just came on the board. So an interesting mix, varying experience, and we're vetting and reviewing things and just making sure that we're assessing the people. So it's back on the people in the organization. That's the number one thing that we're being asked to do. Help the CEO assess the people and the cadence of the efforts inside the organization. If they're not good enough from everything we're asking and what they're looking at, he's going to make some of their decisions. So he's looking for other interesting points of view on those people.
And I just want to tell you that's really working, because they retweet every tweet I put out about the conference because you're speaking here. So they have. Roxanne?
I think what Greg said about making sure you have people that have been through transformations, not just digital experts. A lot of boards went out and wanted to grab somebody from Apple or Google or whatever, and those are great people, don't get me wrong. But you need someone that's actually run a company and been through a transformation. That really makes a big difference. And I think we're spending a ton of time on talent. We're spending a ton of time making sure that we have the right digital talent within the company. And then I'd also say we're spending a ton of time bringing in third-party experts, because we're not all as digitally savvy on the entire board as we'd like to be. So in order to help those who may not have as much experience in digital background, we're bringing in more and more third parties to help with that, assess kind of technically, where are we technically? And what is the digital disruption that we should be worried about?
Right.
If you go back to the Abbott example, we spent a ton of time talking about Google and Apple and Amazon and things they had said in the media and where they were in that journey. And we stepped back from it and said, it's a huge strategy decision to really spend a ton of capital to build the facilities necessary to make these sensors. And we said, at the end of the day, this is what we do. We're a medical device company. If we're going to stay in medical devices, we've got to get really digitally savvy, because that's where the world is going. And if they're held to the same standard, we should be able to really excel in that, really be able to do well, because we know the medical device space. We know what it takes, the rigorous testing that goes through to get through an FDA process. If the tech companies are held to the same standard, they may have, we had to focus on UI, because of course, that's not our area of expertise. How do we get a great UI, a great user experience, and as it relates to the app? But at the end of the day, we're trying to do what we do well and become very digitally savvy at it. And how do we do that? And that's been a ton of time in the board.
And I think there's a lot of sort of insight now that we're getting, because there was a recent report out on the Apple Watch that talks about how many people end up in healthcare things when there's nothing wrong with them, and just because this thing shows tachycardia.
TMI, too much information.
But this isn't a lifestyle. How we've sort of delineated it is, Apple and Google are looking at people helping with lifestyle changes. We're actually helping diabetics monitor their blood glucose. Now, I want one of our sensors, because I want to look at my behavior all day long and decide kind of where I'm at. A lot of our board members are actually doing it, and I'm actually going to do it next. I'm really excited about that. But I'll use a personal example, which was my mother. She was one of the first people in the US to start using the product. And she thought she had one issue, and she took all this data that she'd accumulated from her monitor and put it down, downloaded it from the computer, printed it out, took her to her doctor, and she had a completely different issue. It was so powerful. So she says literally that Libre saved her life. So becoming digitally, my mother's very digitally savvy. You would, she's 80, so she's really hot with that stuff. So she's doing really well. But she downs her, she says, there's something wrong with me and I don't know what it is, and here's my data. And I said, you go, girl.
I love it.
I actually went to my doctor with a spreadsheet one time. He said, look, you're healthy, just leave me alone. I can't look at all this data. I actually want to follow up with you, Roxanne, on one thing, which is, in the tech business, we talk a lot about convergence, and especially with sort of what are ultimately becoming platforms. You can attack from a variety of different points. And so there is some sense of how do you build sort of this universal, not a universal device, but how do you track all parts of somebody's health? And how do you work in an ecosystem where somebody's tracking your blood sugar and somebody else is tracking your heart rate and somebody else is tracking whatever?
Well, I think it's a really good question. It's one, obviously, that we're not trying to solve every issue right now, but we're talking a lot about it. Like, how do we potentially even partner? It's always a little challenging because of the data usage that occurs at the big tech companies, right? If you're a medical device company, you're held to a very high standard about patient, information, and we want to make sure that we're not somehow giving data to people who might not use it in the same context that we use it in. And so there's a lot of dialogue, Jay, around that whole area. It's really tough, but we're here to solve health problems, and that's what we're going to do, and we're going to find a digital way to do it.
Mary, what's your take
on digital devices? No, I was just going back to a couple of things. I guess one is thinking about the boardroom and technology. For us, the whole notion of technology being such an important part of our future was the helpful catalyst that got our board to support the M&A that we did, because we've never done M&A before yet as a company.
Right.
And there's a lot of things we could do. There's a lot of brands that want to get bought, a lot of retail concepts. For that to be our first spot was
That's
important,
powerful.
and that required the board to get on board with that. The other thing I'd say just briefly, so I'm on the board of Starbucks, and that's a great company in that they've got Kevin Johnson is the CEO. He's a former tech person,
right.
And so it's really cool that he also really knows the coffee retail business now as well. Is doing a great job, but he's able to infuse from the start, from the top, sort of the role of technology into that business as well. They just announced yesterday a fund that they're co-investing in called the Valor Fund, and it's about retail tech and food tech. So, in some cases, it's just like a company needs that kind of infusion, I think, from the top.
You
can see it in the mobile app if you use it. It's great, yeah.
So walk us through some capital investment decisions what's the nature of the conversation? I know there's a limited amount you can share here, but so what is the give and take like? What are the concerns? I mean, obviously there's earnings pressure from Wall Street and things like that. Greg shaking his head very vigorously, especially for an old line company like Schneider Electric.
Yeah, it is challenging. But I mean, if the company's well run, and most good companies say there's a cash flow and I can protect that with call it my core business. But I need to be setting aside some funds for advancing the company. The easiest way to do that, of course, and most companies look at some degree of M&A, and Schneider has been very active that way, usually 2 or 3 substantive acquisitions a year, and that's been the case for the last, I'd say, decade. But more recently, we're trying to accelerate in the software as a service space, saying, how do we get energy as a service? We need to go down this kind of a platform approach. And it could also be service as a service around just getting the technicians to service buildings and put mobile platforms in place for companies to find technicians. So we've set aside a fund specifically going after startups here in California and also in China. 2 major markets, 2 areas where there's substantive software skills and leading edge capabilities, but also potentially starting the marketing of those products and services quickly in those 2 key markets for the company. So it's M&A, it's smart R&D in the organization where you have R&D. In this case, we do. Some companies don't, but this is very important, and measuring the efficacy of that. And then finally, lately, it's trying to go find things that are just outside of our realm of expertise, trying to find the next disruptor in our sector early, where we can maybe buy in or partner with that company in some shape or form with this fund.
I think this fund is really powerful, right? Because, I mean, you obviously have the scale to do that, but many companies don't.
Yeah, probably wouldn't, yeah.
You know, GE has a whole approach to that as well.
Well, I'd say you invest or you're dead. I mean, you've got to invest in the new future technologies or else you're just putting your head in the sand. And I think, you know, if you look at an example, you've got to find a way to make digital growth profitable at some point, absolutely. But you're going to have to invest up front.
Right.
I don't think there's any question about that. And I think we've all come to that realization. And then it becomes a question of, you know, how do you moderate that? And how do you, let's use Target as an example. So Target outpaced the industry in digital growth, sorry, Mary, last year.
We're still friends.
But we're still friends. But Target outpaced the industry in digital growth.
She's also your competitor, come to think of it.
Oh, trust me, I know.
I know, we are.
Target's
Hey, you
killing
can sit
it.
closer to me.
But, you know, obviously the constant question is, how do we make that digital sale profitable? And we're, you know, or more profitable. And so it's a huge amount of effort around the company. So the first was investing in getting the digital growth. So we got the digital growth. Now it is, how do you make that as profitable as you can? And so that's a huge amount of effort. But there was investment up front, and we had to say to Wall Street, we're going to invest. We're going to invest in our digital growth. We're going to invest in supply chain. We're going to invest in the stores. We're going to invest in, and you've got to convince them. We took a reset. You know, you took a reset. It's not pretty when you take a reset sometimes, right? I mean, you had to go out and tell Wall Street. So, you know, I think you've got to have guts, and I think Mary's got guts. But, you know, Mary went out and reset the street. Brian Cornell at Target went out and reset. He did a complete reset and said, look, we're going to have to invest. These are the areas we're investing in. It's not easy to do, but you know what? Wall Street should not drive your long-term strategy, because if they do, you won't make the right decisions.
Although I found when we did our reset in 2014, the street reacted positively.
Yeah.
Really positively, because our longer term investors got it. They knew that we needed to do this. And so that gave us a lot more courage to continue to move ahead. You know, in our case, capital allocation, you know, we've got a really strong, we have no debt, we've got a lot of cash flow, but our capital choices are around, you know, building more stores. We're still actively building. We're building 80 stores this year, refurbishing existing stores so the whole fleet stays really modern. And then, of course, all the technical investments. Probably the biggest challenge is it's very hard to frame up exactly what these things are going to cost.
Right.
It's a bit of a moving target, I feel like. We're trying to really figure out what do we need to invest from a technology perspective. That's a little more challenging than a physical, tangible store, right?
And also the benefits are very hard to predict sometimes. I remember we talked one year here about the Disney Magic Band project, which cost $1 billion. And the feedback from the street was, why don't you just go build another ride, another attraction, when your parks are not seeing the traffic that they used to? And they actually got a phenomenal return on that project from what we can tell. One of the things I want to talk about is, I alluded to in my morning talk about Alphabet and the fact that they haven't made any money off their Waymo division yet, because they really have only a few hundred paying customers for their Uber-like service called Waymo One. But they've got extraordinarily deep pockets. I mean, when I was preparing my talk, I was thinking about how much money, I was just guesstimating, of course, but it's billions and billions of dollars that they've spent on this project that they've seen zero return on right now. Most companies in the world couldn't do anything close to that. So how do you compete against these companies that have such deep pockets, these big tech platform companies with sophisticated machine learning capabilities, and a lot of sort of a tech is natural to them? Do you worry about them? Maybe not so much. Actually, you do in Amazon, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's a different frame. It's a different frame. I mean, I feel like our investors understand if they're looking for retail growth and there's a scarcity of that, they're going to look at companies like Target and Ulta Beauty, you know what I mean? And so we have to compete as it relates to customer experience, especially things like speed of delivery, but we don't have to compete with everything that those companies do. In fact, we partner with them quite a bit, right, to do a lot of what we do.
There's got to be a certain set of nerve-wracking things about, we're making this call, this is where we compete, but these big guys are out here trying to encroach on our space as well. Before I switch to Roxanne, I do want to acknowledge something. I'm going to give you a little preview of what's happening after lunch, but I don't even know if Roxanne knows this. We run an annual research survey every year, and this year we've done it for 5 years, and this year we decided to give an award, and Target ranked first.
Thank you for that.
We gave out awards last night at a dinner, but so your achievements sort of were really quite amazing. But back to you.
Thank you. So I think, you know, how I've sort of, in my own mind, thought about Google and Apple. They throw, as you said, money at a lot of things. They literally are doing shots, moonshots all over the place. We have to be worried about them. What we have to do, though, is understand what we do well. So back to my Abbott example, we know medical devices. We made a great medical device. This sensor is the best out there in terms of what it does. It is FDA approved, and it monitors blood glucose as accurately as a finger prick, which is why diabetics so quickly, they can scan every minute, know where their blood glucose is. That's what we do well. We knew what we didn't do well, which was the app development and the UI and all of that. We had to get other people to help with that. And then ultimately, do I think it would be great to be partners with them if we could figure out the deal with the data and what we do with the data and what they do with our data? Sure, at some point that would be great. But at this point, I think we do what we do well. We focus on doing it in a digital way, but know what we don't do well. And combine.
Yeah, and this example really illustrates where we started this morning, which is you have to codify your domain know-how and leverage it. And that's what makes your company different, right?
I was just going to add to your point, most of the big players you're talking about, Google, Apple, good examples, or Facebook, Amazon, they're all using smaller suppliers to advance their agenda. Some of the speakers we're going to even have this afternoon have those customers using, they're using, Shawshank is a perfect example, his company, Global Logic. He's doing a lot of the development for the names we were just talking about, their large clients. They can't do that work themselves, as much as they're viewed as omnipresent and very capable. So again, I'll point to the trucking industry, autonomy and autonomous driving. You touched on it before. There's a lot of small companies that are working with Google, but they're also working with all the other manufacturers.
Right.
Up in Silicon Valley or in Germany or in China again. And you need to go find those companies. That's part of what the board will also be bringing in terms of ideas or insights, and also what the business development team of all sorts of companies need to be looking for. And saying it's not just the big guys we have to worry about because they can put a phenomenal solution together potentially that'll disrupt your sector, but there's a lot of people helping them. And you can, if you're doing your homework and you're using either consultants or you ground the feet with the rest of your own team, I think you can find ways to accelerate your company by saying, what do we need? What are we weak in? And let's go find those companies rather than just worrying about what these guys might do to get to us first. And then bring it on board as you're ready and more targeted, I think, frankly, to go after the market. And we have a lot of discussions about those types of things, and it's actually helping in terms of the strategy.
So let's get ready for questions. I'm going to come to you in 2 minutes or less. Oh, we already have a question. Okay, I will come to you right now. Go ahead.
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay, so Adrian Kearns with Magenic. From the digital, now it's on. From the perspective of digital, can you talk a little bit about how that's impacted your supply chain, and do you see the supply chains of your competitors as a threat, or do you see your own supply chain as a differentiator, specifically in the retail space?
Mary?
It's a work in process for us. I would say, as I said at the beginning, one of the areas that I think we were under-invested, both in terms of vision for the future as well as capacity and capability, has been our supply chain. So, we are actively investing to support growth, to support more speed of shipping, as well as to use technology and data to help us do things that, just to become a basic omnichannel retailer. And there's a lot more. So I'd say we're kind of a little bit early innings in really maximizing, optimizing. We have a very complex box and a lot of changes that happen within the box, a lot of tiny pieces of, 25,000 SKUs. You guys have a much bigger box, but everything in our box is tiny. And so the amount of opportunity as it relates to end-to-end management of our inventory flows is pretty big for us. So we're a work in process on that, but it is actually one of the most important unlock areas for our business in the future.
And I think the same is true for Target. We've invested heavily in supply chain. It was one of the core pillars that Brian, when he did the reset, we were going to spend several $billions in our supply chain and modernizing. Thank you.
I knew exactly what you meant.
Modernizing, hello. To modernize our supply chain, but more importantly, to allow the delivery from store. we're basically within 1 hour of 70% of our customers, right? So if we can actually deliver from store, but you gotta have the right supply chain to be able to replenish the store, to fulfill at the store. So it's a big effort, not just in the physical, what you think of the traditional supply chain, distribution center, blah, 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 but all the way down to the store level and what needs to happen for, if you're taking all that product out of the store and you're picking from the store, which we did a ton over the holidays, how do you replenish those stores so that the customer experience in the store is still a great experience? So there's so many things now about supply chain that are not like the traditional way we thought about it, right?
Even just inventory accuracy, right?
Exactly, that's what I mean. Your whole inventory accuracy and how that all works, it's a huge effort, so.
Can you talk about the acquisition of Shipt?
Well, Shipt has worked out really well for us. We knew that, first of all, the Shipt shopper was a
Well, we start with what it is because...
Okay, I'm sorry. Shipt is it's a subscription-based service, and for a fee, you can get all your deliveries from certain stores, and Target was one of them. And the Shipt shopper develops a relationship with the individual. So I'm a Shipt shopper for Mary. So Mary contacts me on my app. She says she needs all these things from Target. And I go out and I shop for those products and I bring it to Mary's home. What we knew about Shipt was that the people that worked for Shipt as Shipt shoppers were mothers primarily their kids were in school and they just wanted to fill in a couple of hours, but they loved Target. And they loved going to Target. And so they thought, what better way? I can't spend all my money at Target. I can spend other people's money at Target. Yes!
So interesting.
So we said, okay, cool, that's great. We looked at it, we looked at a bunch of other people, but what they were doing and Instacart was doing, what other people were doing, et cetera. But Shipt seemed to fit right down our bowling alley, okay? It was, first of all, the Shipt shopper was someone who loved Target, and a lot of use on Shipt was for Target. So we thought it was the perfect acquisition. Other stores, we still allow other stores to use the Shipt capability, but for Target itself, so it was a big, opportunity for us to have that personalized experience, which is important to Target with our guest, have someone the guest trusted, and we wanted the guest to develop a relationship. So I wanted to develop a relationship with Mary because I'm coming into her home, and we physically bring the product into the home if they want us to and take it out of the bag, whatever they want us to do. But I think that's really important, in our relationship. So Shipt was important to us.
Other questions?
Hi, Trent Johnson with Wavemaker Ventures. As I listen to many of the examples of how you all are embracing disruption and innovation, many of them seem to err on the side of acquisitions and partnership. Particularly, Greg, the example that you gave in terms of having folks that would look into China, look into Germany, look for that startup set of communities. The question I would ask is, does that, from a board perspective then, how do you think about internal build as a mechanism to drive innovation and disruption? Is it a distant third or is it on par with the other two?
It's a challenging issue for, I think, a lot of companies. When you're trying to get transition or change accelerated because you're being impacted by competition or market dynamic, sometimes you say, I don't have the skills, or I know I'm missing a certain area of capability. So the default, to the point you were making, is sometimes you're going to go after merger or partner. That is not the first decision. More often than not, you're saying, what can we do with our own IP, our own intellectual property in designing something, whether it's a service or a product. And that's where you're trying to get more efficacy or more return. And you're clearly going to get a bigger return there. But if it's not in your core wheelhouse of capability, then I would say, because it's a supply chain issue and you want to go to some people that have good pieces of supply chain technology or good applications on web interfaces to deal with customers, you just say, look, I need to bring that in to enable my story back to market, go reach my customer quicker. And the staff that I have, frankly, don't have enough experience there. We know how to maybe make an RFP and move the process along, judiciously. But I need to recognize that I'm falling behind here, and if I'm going to make a step function change, or frankly take a bit of a swing at a home run or a swing at a few singles to augment the strategy, that's how you think I'm going to get that to move forward. It's a healthy discussion at a board level, and it's a healthy discussion within the management team. It's an honest discussion typically, and Ideally, it's first in-house, but I would say when you realize the skills aren't there, you really have to accelerate or continue to focus outside.
But I think you've got to be brutally honest with yourself. Do you have those skills? Because I've seen companies just spin their wheels, and there's a bunch of examples that are in my head that I can't use. But I've seen people just spin their wheels thinking they could do something that they just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And then they wound up having to go outside. So I think it's clearly knowing your strengths and understanding what you have internally and being brutally honest about that. I always say the truth shall set you free, because if you really know truly where you are and what your capabilities are, you'll make the right decision. But
yeah. I would just say, I mean, Roxanne's a great example of somebody in the boardroom that can drive, you know, I mean, not to just compliment you here, but I've seen it.
Thank you for wearing Target red, too.
Yes, exactly.
We
But
appreciate
I
it.
was on the board of Target at the same time, for some period of time, several years ago. And to have people in the boardroom who've been through and can recognize and push the team when they need it is really important.
So I'm going to borrow a Michael Chewy patented technique, and I'm going to do a lightning round that I haven't alerted you to. So, I'm going to go with Greg first, and then the rest of you is not so lightning. So what's the one biggest challenge you face as a board? And don't tell us the company, that way you won't embarrass anybody, but what's like the biggest board level challenge that you confront today?
It's all about leadership in any kind of company. Have you got the right talent? Are you advancing that talent? If you can get that right, a lot of other pieces come into play, and there are dynamics in every company and every industry, and sometimes you got to recognize change is needed, not just maybe at the most senior level, but in the C-suite, to drive the company's strategy forward. That is, I think, the biggest issue usually.
I agree with that too, but I also think about really anticipating digital disruption and disruption. And every company is going to be disrupted, they just don't know it yet, right? But so I think at the end of the day, trying to really think through, like, how can we be disrupted here, and how, you know, what could be that technology when we don't have all the answers. And that's why I think, you know, having some third parties involved as well. But you've really got to be more anticipatory today, and I think more future, and, you know, really step back and say, this company, any company can be disrupted and will be disrupted at some point. And, you know, how do we think about that?
So it's a different conversation, but it's sort of interesting to learn how companies are doing this sort of scenario planning. Mary?
Yeah, I would just say, for me, it's being both the CEO and on my board and on another board, right? It's kind of like the openness, you know, the role of management versus board. And so when do you push, or when do you hold back as a director? When do you stay open and actually seek input as a CEO, or push out and say you're getting too in the weeds? I mean, it's a constant, I don't know, battle is a word, but a constant weighing that I do all the time and thinking about it, you know. But in this area, in the whole digital area, it's the area that is the most important for us, and it's I think none of us have all the answers. So this is an area that I try my best to be very open as a director.
Well, if you just look at the history of what business schools have taught, and we hope we're different, but, you know, most CEOs come from finance and marketing, and you don't necessarily have a tech competence.
And I think knowing what you're good at and where you need the help is what is going to help any company.
Fantastic. Well, let's thank the panelists for an absolutely superb panel.
Thank you.